Oh, really? Chuck Taylor? Who was educated in the United
I
States?
can't think of Brenda's last name, but she was the lead person also.
I'm glad you're all talking. We're going to spend some time looking at the website of the museum, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And as part of that, we'll look at survivor testimony. So what I'd like to do is, Jackie first, do you want to introduce Mr. Crabtree first?
I'm sorry, what?
You want to introduce Chris first? Just, yeah, I'm sorry.
Actually, I'm happy to have Chris Crabtree introduce himself. Chris Crabtree, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Chris Crabtree. I'm with Congressman Jim Banks' office, and we're just strong supporters of what Jackie and the team here are doing, and I really appreciate the opportunity to get with you guys today and see what you're learning so that you can communicate it to the next generations of Hoosiers, and I'll be around the whole time if anybody wants to talk afterwards. Thanks.
So Chris would have been here all day, but as many of you know, there was like some crisis mode yesterday with storms and tornadoes again.
It got nasty last night.
Those were nasty ones.
Before doing that, I want to talk a little bit about the use of survivor testimony, and we'll use the website to do that. For a long, long time, when Holocaust education was getting underway, when I and other people were getting underway, you would go to a workshop like this or whatever it was, and the first thing you were always told was, bring a survivor in. And that was a nice thing to do. At one time, there were about 15 survivors here in Fort Wayne. 6 or 7 of them were willing to speak in classrooms. They're all gone now. Doris Fogel is the last remaining one, and Doris now lives in Chicago. And I mean, this is across the country. The average survivor today is almost 90 years old, and either the survivors are gone or they can't speak anymore just because of health reasons and so forth and so on. We did one of these workshops at IPFW about 5 or 6 years ago, when we brought in a very remarkable survivor, Nessie Godine, whom we're going to look at here in a minute. And we brought her in, and she's everybody's grandmother kind of person. Well, she's 92 years old now, and travel is an issue and so forth. Having said that, we want to, survivor testimony is really critical. The idea of personal experience is really critical. If you talk to World War II vets, or if you talk to Korean vets, or whatever it happens to be. And so the next best thing is through filmed or taped survivor testimony. As some of you may know, Spielberg has spent almost all the profits, virtually all the profits from the movie, on the Shoah Foundation, which is at the University of Southern California. And to this date, they've done close to 60,000 interviews of survivors, and they're in the process of cataloging them and putting them on the web and so forth and so on. If you go to various sources, you find a lot of films that you can buy on survivor testimony. And so it's an important part of the process. And again, for just the reasons of time and the passage of time, you can't invite survivors in anymore. It's just not a practicality. So using the tapes, I think, are a very good way to go. And I'm going to suggest a way to do it here with the website, a very focused way to do it. And we'll get to that a little bit later on. So just to introduce the website, how many of you have been on it before? Good, most of you. Good. Okay, good. First of all, just ushmm.org. The first thing from a technical point of view, anytime you're on the website, you want to get back to the home page, just put your cursor on the logo, the block letters, and it will take you right back to the website. There are 2 search functions. One of them is up here, right there, and the other one is, if I can find it here, right here, I'm sorry, it is. This is the more focused one. If you click Holocaust Encyclopedia and then go to this one, it's a bit more focused. And everybody see okay with me sitting here? You guys okay? It's a bit more focused in that you can go into specific kinds of items on the website. Articles, the ID cards that we'll talk about, Jeff and I will work on that later, survivor testimony, oral history, footage, and that. So if you want to be really focused in something and get a particular kind of resource, you can go in and do that. For example, let's say that, let's start with the animated maps. There are 14, oops, hang on. There are 14 animated maps. You can get it there, or, well, let's do it that way.
Yeah, put what one you want.
Yeah, I got to put what I want. Let's say World War II. And pardon my type, I'm a bad typist on this. Keys are different than I'm used to here. So So if I type World War II animated maps, I get a World War II and the Holocaust. And this, I think, is a really good resource to use to introduce your World War II unit. Because what happens here, I'll just play a minute or two of it. You get a map like this, click on the logo, the icon,
The Holocaust was the state-sponsored, systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945. Jews were the primary victims. 6 million were murdered. Roma,
That's the old
gypsies,
definition.
physically and mentally disabled people, and Poles were also targeted for destruction or decimation for racial, ethnic, or national reasons. Millions more, including homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents, also suffered grievous oppression and death under Nazi tyranny. The Nazi Party came to power in Germany in 1933. The Nazis believed that Germans were members of a biologically superior race, threatened with extinction through the struggle for survival with inferior races. They saw Jews especially as a biological threat to the German Aryan race. Adolf Hitler moved to extend German power in Central Europe, annexing Austria and destroying Czechoslovakia in 1938 to 1939. In the aftermath of the violence of the Kristallnacht pogroms, the Nazis instituted the first systematic roundups of German and Austrian Jews. They deported approximately 30,000 Jewish men to Dachau and other concentration camps.
Okay, there are 14 of those maps on all kinds of different topics. World War II and the Holocaust in general. There's one on the St. Louis. Someone asked about the St. Louis before, the Warsaw Ghetto. Again, 14 of them. They generally run 5 to 7 minutes with the video or the audio. And what's neat about it is you can stop it and it picks up literally right in mid-word if it's a 2 or 3 syllable word. It's really a good way to use, and it shows the movement of it. You know, the problem with maps, looking at maps, is they're so static, and this shows it with the arrows back and forth. And I think that's really helpful, and again, it's very accessible. One point I would note, just a general teaching point, in teaching about this subject, is that students are not going to know the geography. I mean, Americans don't know the geography, let's be really honest about it. You know, I used to tell the pre-service teachers that if you give students a map, if they know that blue is water and up is north, anything else is a bonus, right? Because we know we don't know geography. And that's particularly true with Holocaust when you start talking about Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and so forth. Americans just don't know geography, so you really have to be sure that they understand that. When, for example, you talk about East Prussia as that sort of distended part of Germany that's today part of Poland, students aren't going to understand what that means. When you start talking about the fact that because of changing borders, a town in Eastern Europe might have 3 or 4 names. I mean, there are towns in, let's say, Belarus today that have a Polish name, a Russian name, and a Yiddish name. And so this becomes very, very confusing to students who don't know the geography to begin with. So using these maps, again, for whatever topic it happens to be, and again, there are 14 of them, and let's see if I can find the whole list here for you, if I get to it. Yeah, here, animated maps. Einsatzgruppen on the Einsatzgruppen moving into the Soviet Union, Dachau in terms of movement around Dachau in southern Germany, the process of liberation, World War II and the Holocaust, which is an excellent one to introduce the World War II unit, the Holocaust in general, the St. Louis, Warsaw Ghetto, Auschwitz, rescue, resistance, the Lutz Ghetto in central Poland, the aftermath of the Holocaust, the European rail system. No, I'm sorry. Those are the ones for the animated maps. If the map comes up with this sort of dark shading, it's animated. If it doesn't have the dark shading, if it's more like this with just the blue, then it's just a straight map. There are several hundred of maps on the website. You simply access them like this. In most cases, if you want to put them into a PowerPoint, you can just do a right-click Save As, and you can do that. Some of them, for some reason, they're a little bit hard to do that. But in general, you can figure out a way to put them into PowerPoints. This one of the European rail system, when we were talking about the systematic nature of all that before, those are the major rail lines. Obviously not all the lines, but the major rail lines, mainly heading from Western Europe to Auschwitz, if you can see my pointer there, right about there. So imagine again, when we're talking about this systematic nature, the process involved in moving people from, let's say, Rome up to Auschwitz. And again, this systematic idea. So I would really suggest that you make use of the maps. And if you go back out here again. If you go back up here, there's the animated map link and then the regular map link. And again, all you do is click on that, put in the topic. Somebody give me one just at random. Let's see if there's one there. Somebody give me one. Some topic.
Krakow.
Krakow. Hard and the bad type. Can't type when people are looking at me. Okay. Krakow in 1933. Krakow in 42 to 44. The Krakow Ghetto in 42. Let's look at that one. That's not just Krakow. That's a detailed map of the ghetto in Krakow.
So how did they get the walls up so fast?
That's a very good question. In some cases, they didn't. When a ghetto was formed, generally it would be formed in the Jewish quarter of the town. Sometimes the ghettos had been walled way back from the Middle Ages because Jewish ghettos were. In other cases, the ghettos would be what are called open ghettos, where it was just established that this is the ghetto. Sometimes they would put up barbed wire. A lot of times they would put up barbed wire and then start building the walls around them when they would be closed. A ghetto might have been open as an open ghetto where people could go in and out, and maybe 6 months later, let's say, became a closed ghetto. All different kinds of possibilities. It's interesting when you look at the Lodz Ghetto, which is one of the really interesting ones. There was a main street going right down the center of the Lodz Ghetto. It had been the Jewish ghetto before the war, the Jewish quarter before the war, and they really had a problem. And the problem was that this was the main street through town, and particularly it was the main street where the trolleys went. So they built the ghetto on either side of the street, and then a bridge went over the top. There's a very famous picture of this bridge going over with the streetcar running underneath it. So you have all these different kinds of structures to the ghetto. One of the things that typically happened with the ghettos, and this is particularly the case in Warsaw, the ghetto began. There were the Jewish area of Warsaw, there were two sections. There was a sort of a northwestern section that was fairly good size and sort of a southeastern section that was smaller. When the Warsaw Ghetto was formed, all the Jews from all over Warsaw had to go into the larger one. Originally around 50,000 people lived there. By the time the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the size had been reduced by about 2/3 and the population had been increased from 50,000 to 460,000. So all of a sudden, an area that was supposed to hold under 50,000 people held 8 times that. Well, ask your students, ask your students, speculate what the conditions would have been like there. And I think, disease and all those different kinds of things. Okay, so I mean, that's sort of how the ghettos were functioning. It's very important to note, and again, I always have to add additional things here. How many ghettos were there in Western Europe?
There was one in France, wasn't there?
0. There were no ghettos in Western Europe. The only ghetto that was in any way in Western Europe was Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. There were no ghettos in Western Europe. Why? Because the Germans, the Nazi regime, knew they couldn't get away with ghettos in Western Europe. The ghettos were all in Poland, Latvia, later on Hungary, Romania, and so forth and so on. One of the survivor testimony, when we talked to testimony a minute, where I've got one clip on there about the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay, so that's the maps. Let's, for example, look at Historical film footage, let's see, let's try Ghetto again there and see what happens. Okay, there are 10 films dealing with the ghettos. For example, number 1 is Lodz. And it's a minute and 34 seconds long. Not particularly good footage, but actual footage. This is of a winter scene, obviously, and they're chopping ice to get water, I guess is what's going on. Again, the footage is not very good, but it's usable in that regard. One of the nice things also is that there'll be a description of what's going on. The German army occupied Lodz in September 39. The Jews were forced to move to designated areas, which was sealed. To answer your question before, it was not sealed for about 6 or 7 months. And the footage illustrates conditions during winter where there was hardship, including no supplies of food and fuel and so forth and so on. And notice also beneath that, there will be hot links here. For example, this the film footage is of Lodz, and so if you click on this hot link down here, you get an article about Lodz. And you have photographs about Lodz. You have artifacts. This is a scale model that a man who was in Lodz, a man by the name of Rosenstein, I think his name was, he built this scale model. It's kind of hard to see here. He built this scale model, wood scale model of the Warsaw Ghetto. It used to be in the Holocaust Museum. It's since been returned to Poland. And you have personal histories. In this case, these are the ID cards that we'll talk about in a minute. And any of these personal histories that come up in this kind of dark color shading will take you to a filmed oral history. So here is an oral history
wherever you went,
about
somebody's
Lodz.
dying. And it becomes part of
And
first 2, 3, and 4,
48
you
seconds
find them
long.
as a shock. But
So
later
get
you find them,
all
you
these
get quite
cross
used to them.
links.
It's
All these cross links going on. And again, there are two oral histories about Lodz, several ID cards, and again, we'll talk about those in a minute. And then ways that you can get to all the oral histories, if you can see down here at the bottom, or you can get the ID card. So there are all these kinds of cross links that go back and forth. Now, I will give you one caveat here. This is one of these things when you get on it, and 5 hours later you realize you've been on it for 5 hours. I mean, you kind of get into that kind of circumstance. Let's go back over here. Again, the links, articles. Let's say, for example, let's say Theresienstadt. Oops. Okay, got that right, yeah. Okay, 44 articles dealing with Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was the so-called Paradise Ghetto. It was a concentration camp located about 40 miles northeast of Prague, and it was used as sort of a model camp. Whenever the Red Cross would want to inspect a camp, the regime would always send the Red Cross to Theresienstadt. It was convenient, it was easy to get to, it wasn't in the war zone because there was virtually no fighting in Czechoslovakia. And so conditions in Theresienstadt were quite a bit better than in most of the other camps. Theresienstadt, a lot of the people sent to Theresienstadt were intellectuals. For example, half the members of the Berlin Symphony wound up in Theresienstadt. A lot of intellectuals, painters, artists, and so forth were there. And sometimes you're again referred to as the Paradise Ghetto, sometimes referred to as the Family Ghetto or the Family Camp. And so we've got all these articles. For example, there's one down here called Cultural Life that will talk about the artists and so forth that were in Theresienstadt. There was a lot of artwork came out of Theresienstadt. A lot of children's poetry came out of Theresienstadt. There's a link to a map here showing Czechoslovakia. There's a map of what used to be Czechoslovakia, what is now the Czech Republic. And here's Prague, and then here's Theresienstadt, right on the Elbe River, running up into Germany. This is the border with Germany. And this is Theresienstadt, or in Czech, it's called Terezin. That's the name of it. And again, it's about an hour or so by bus outside of Prague. I was in Theresienstadt a few years ago, and it was very interesting. I didn't really understand. They always used to talk about the large and the small fortresses, and until you get there, you don't really understand how it's set up. What's interesting is the so-called large fortress, which was part of the concentration camp, is today simply the city of Terezin, and people are living there. You can kind of wander in and out of the buildings, and if you wander in the wrong place, you wander into somebody's backyard right next to where these things occurred. It was really kind of disarming. And what was really disarming about going to Theresienstadt was as you walked from the large to the small fortress, I looked up and there was a golf course right along the edge of the what used to be the concentration camp. It was very, very disarming with that. Also, by the way, in Prague you have the best preserved Jewish quarter in Central Europe. Prague, there was no fighting around Prague, and therefore Prague did not suffer destruction the way places like Warsaw and Berlin and all those other places suffered during the war, physical destruction of the buildings. And so Prague is very much the way it looked like. Have you been to Prague? Yeah, Prague is a really neat city. It really is. I hardly suggest it if you want to go on vacation over there. It's a really, really interesting place. And there's this very interesting Jewish quarter. Did you go, Brooklyn?
Oh yeah, I have. Wasn't it supposed to be preserved as like what the old city used to look like? When you go there, you're like, what was wrong with it? It looks gorgeous. There's a castle. It looks like Disney.
Yeah, no, exactly it does. Yeah, the Charles River Bridge and all that, or the Charles Bridge.
And it's very cheap, so go visit.
Yes, it's very, by European standards, it's very, very inexpensive. But again, you can find these, and then here's a map, another map of the major ghettos. And again, noticing Theresienstadt, right? You can see the cursor right there. Notice all the other ghettos are to the east, none to the west. And again, the reason being that the Nazi regime knew that it couldn't get away with things in the west. And also another reason being that where did the Jews of Europe live? Primarily in the east. That's one reason when we said earlier, no war, no Holocaust, if the idea of the Holocaust is the annihilation of the Jews, you first have to control the Jews. Where did they live? They lived in the east. There were 9 million Jews in Europe in 1933, the great majority living Poland to the east. Much smaller numbers in Germany, Denmark, Holland, and so forth, and so on. Okay, let me go back up here again. Let me go back to the home page. This new one across here, they're constantly adding new things, and this is a very new one. It actually was posted in response to Charlottesville, and this is the meaning of neo-Nazi Nazi symbols, and this is the one I mentioned before. The resurgence of neo-Nazism in the United States, so racial ideology and how it plays into neo-Nazism. This is a picture of examining hair color and skin color for purposes of genetics. This is the order, the order of the races. They actually had these posters, and the posters would have all kinds of front and side shots of people. And each poster, or each group of posters, each group of pictures was supposed to depict someone as being German and maybe North German or South German or Italian or Romanian, whatever it happened to be. And again, these posters were published by the Nazi propaganda ministry or by the race office, the Nazi race office, and they would be displayed on billboards and street posts and all that in schools and that. Again, to try to convince the German population of these differences. It's interesting to note this idea of blood and soil. It's interesting to note that not only did they distinguish between Germans and non-Germans, they also distinguished between the racial characteristics of South Germans and North Germans. And then they tied that into the racial characteristics, quote, racial characteristics of the Nordics. For example, one of the ideas of Nazi racial ideology was that you had the Germans, and you had the Austrians, and then you had the Nordics, the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, who were first cousins. They would talk about our Nordic cousins, meaning, again, the Scandinavians, you know, Lindquist, blonde hair, blue-eyed. I mean, I'm Swedish. And so there was this idea of these things. And one of the things that's very interesting to note when you talk about the Holocaust in general is that Nazi German policy, the policy of the regime, was very much a factor of the racial composition of the conquered land. Where, for example, the racial composition of the conquered land was seen as not German, for example, the Soviet Union, Russian, policies were much more severe than those places that were seen as being more Nordic. Therefore, racial policies in Holland were much less severe than racial policies, let's say, in Poland, because the Poles were Slavs, the Dutch were seen as being, quote, our Nordic cousins. And that's a very important point to note. That's one reason why there were no ghettos in the West. That's one reason, again, why when Poland is invaded in September of '39, the first ghettos are formed within weeks. In Holland, the Franks don't go into hiding for over 2 years. Why? They don't have to, because the policies are not that severe. And in Denmark, the policies are never instituted. You know, you always read about the Star? The Star of David, Jews in Denmark never wore the star. For two reasons. Number one, Denmark was seen as being so close racially, the Danes in general. And number two, there was no such thing as anti-Semitism in Denmark. Whereas in the East, policies were enacted right away. The ghettos right away, the mass murders right away in the Soviet Union in 1941. It's a very important point to note. I mean, that it denotes the systematic nature of what they did. Now, if you go down a little bit farther here, there's some posters dealing again with that. Free will. Free will is what that poster says, the free will. The use of these terms, and again, this is the website dealing with neo-Nazism in response to Charlottesville, so that's this particular website. Ethnic cleansing, mixed race. Very famous picture from the Olympics. Okay, so that's across the top of the front page here, and again, it changes from time to time. You go over here to Encyclopedia. You can kind of scan down, you can see all kinds of things. One that's a very interesting one, and one I would really suggest you use with students, is this one called The Holocaust, a Learning Site for Students. And there's a hot link here, or you can get it directly by search function. And when you get into that, you see several general categories: Nazi rule, Jews in pre-war Germany, final solution, the camp system, rescue and resistance. And if you click on any of these, we talked about Voyage to St. Louis before, you come to an article, generally a page, page and a half, on that particular topic. So what you could do if you wanted to, you can print these, they print sort of as PDFs, or you can email them, but you can print them anyway, and that really gives you a really core curriculum if you want to look at these topics. This is an oral history over here. This is an artifact. This is a map. Again, just on the St. Louis. And if you go back to the start of the learning site for students, there are, it's about 24 topics here that they have here. I think it's 19 or 20, 21, something like that. Topics that are there on all these. So again, you could really do whatever you wanted to do with specific topics, all accessible, and as we've said before, all accurate. And again, I think I can't emphasize how much that idea of accuracy comes into play. And down at the bottom, cross-links, a glossary of key terms, alphabetized. Excuse me. facts, oral histories, ID cards, again, we're going to get to in a while. All kinds of different links. There are even a few musical selections on here. Okay. So I would really urge you to look at that one. Let's go back to the Holocaust Encyclopedia again. Oops, let's go back this way and start this way. And again, you have all these key articles. There's an article about Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide. Now, what you have down here, at the bottom of that page, is a list of 24 topics to study, and we've created that list, at least part of that list, in one of the documents that we gave you. Again, organized by topics and then subtopics. And again, you know, even if you're doing a full course, are you doing a full course?
18 weeks.
18 weeks, yeah. Even if you're doing that, that's more than you would ever need to put together a whole course. And one of the nice things that's about this is it's available to students. You don't have to buy an expensive book, which obviously funding doesn't allow you to do. It's all there, it's all available, and it's a controlled source. And with websites out there, as I said before, there are good websites, there are well-intentioned bad websites, and there are bad websites. Bad websites are the inaccurate ones, or even worse, the denier ones. And again, to simply say to kids, you know, just look it up on the internet is a good way to make sure that the principal calls you into the office the next morning. You all know that, right? So this really gives you a controlled way of doing this. And one of the things I would suggest with regard to websites, the list that you have there that we've given you, I think that you have to be sort of prescriptive and maybe a little bit doctrinaire with your students on this. That if students want to research the topic, they use those websites. And if they want to use another website, they have to show it to you and you have to give it a thumbs up or thumbs down. They don't just go looking for websites out there, because who knows what they're going to get into. My guess is if you simply say, go look it up on the internet, several of your kids are going to get into denier websites or neo-Nazi websites. I mean, it's just out there. So you really have to be very, very prescriptive on this. And again, here is all you're ever going to need. And here's this overview of topics to teach. Another listing of it. Slightly different format. And again, when you link into these, you're going to find articles, you're going to find links to maps, the whole bit. You understand what I'm talking about here. Now, the only thing about using the website is the only way you learn to do it is obviously get in and plow your way through it. Let me go down here a minute. Resources for educators. Teaching about the Holocaust. Some critical questions. How could Hitler make the Holocaust happen by himself? Well, what do we know? It didn't. But the fact that so many people have that impression has led the museum educational staff to say we need to address the question. So there's a rejoinder, if you will, to the question. Why didn't they all leave? Emigration. So you get in there, and here's a discussion about that. And about some other topics. I was thinking something else. They move it. Here are some other key questions, common questions. Was Hitler solely responsible for the Holocaust? I mean, these are the questions a lot of times kids will ask you. Why didn't they leave? Why wasn't there more resistance? You know, there's this idea, the phrase that used to be used, they went like sheep to the slaughter. There was resistance in every camp. There was resistance in every ghetto. What happened if you disobeyed in order to participate in an atrocity? There is this thing that one of the things, you know, that the soldiers who took part, the SS and that, would have been killed or severely punished if they didn't take part. There is not one incident on record where a soldier who refused to take part in an action was ever disciplined. They were usually transferred to something else. So this belies the idea, you know, when the trials were held after the war, what did they all say? The little phrase, I was following orders. Well, yeah, they were. the fact of it is that those who said, I can't do this, were usually transferred to other kinds of duty. It's a very interesting kind of thing. There's a very interesting book written about that, Battalion 101, about some police officers from Hamburg. Wasn't one of Hitler's relatives Jewish? The answer is no, and it doesn't really matter. Why were the Jews singled out for extermination? Again, the museum still uses that word, and I wish they'd change it. What did the United States know about the Holocaust, and how did it respond? Again, this idea that the Western democracies didn't know. Well, the fact of the matter is the Western democracies knew in great detail. So anyway, there's just some common questions. And again, you find these as you go along. The question of resistance we just talked about. Okay, let's back up here. Why teach about the Holocaust? Why should students learn this history? What are the most significant lessons students from learn? Why is a particular reading, image, document, or film appropriate for conveying the topics you wish to teach? And I would add to that, why might a particular image or film not be appropriate for teaching about the Holocaust? For example, as we mentioned before, you don't put up picture after picture after picture of bodies. You may show it to students depending upon the age level, depending upon the maturity of your students. You don't bombard it with them. And in that regard, I think you would even go a little bit further. You all know that every class you have is different, right? You may use a particular film or a particular photograph with your first period US class, and you don't with your fifth period class because it's simply a different group of students. I mean, you have to make some very, very hard judgments along the way here. So I think you really have to do that. Down here, teacher training programs. Dennis, you just went to one in the summer, right? You want to talk about that for a minute?
I went to the Belfer National Conference
Right here.
This past summer. It's a 3-day program at the museum. You're there all day. We get in early, so we got to spend like we get 2 hours on the floor by ourselves before anyone else shows up. You go floor by floor every day. They give you a whole bunch of different things you do in class. It's great. They give you a lot of free things to walk away with too, so it's awesome. Yeah.
There's not an enrollment fee. You do have to pay your own expenses.
Yeah, but they have scholarships.
And they have scholarships.
Yeah.
I think it's for schools with high poverty rates. Is that how it works?
I think it's just I just signed up as teachers in general, so
Maybe-
they see about my
maybe
area. So like they have a certain amount they're willing to go out to like Indiana in general.
It's usually 3 days for language arts people, followed by 3 days for social studies people. Mid-July.
I think it was end of July.
End of July, which is the worst time in the world to be in
Oh yeah, it's
DC.
super hot.
I mean, the steam literally comes off the cement that time of
Yep.
year. But the museum's always cold, so it's not 100 degrees out and you're wearing a sweater inside. It's kind of weird. They've a wonderful building that can't figure out how to run the air conditioner and heater. But anyway, this is the Belfer program. Who was in charge of this? Gretchen or Kristen or?
Cameron.
Well, Cameron. What's her name? I can't think of her name. Cameron Walpole.
Yep.
Yeah. But anyway, next year it's Language Arts, July 23rd to 25th. Social Studies, July 26th to 28th. It is designed as an introductory program. It is not a competitive thing. I don't know how many, probably a couple hundred teachers.
The social studies one there was I think 125.
Okay, yeah. It's usually about 250 language arts and social studies together. Again, it's a 3-day thing, so you basically go out one day, you're there 3 days, and go home the end of the 3rd day. And sometimes, maybe a couple people got together and drove, you could kind of save money and save expenses and so forth. I think what you said about going in the museum early is important, because if you've been in there when it's crowded, I mean, there's some real issues there, particularly on the 4th floor. If you've ever been on the 4th floor when it's crowded, I mean, you just might as well skip it. You just can't see anything. But going in there early, you avoid the crowds, and you also get a very different feel to the building when you're in there without the crowds. It's really interesting. I've been in there a couple times when there were one of our groups out there, and the only people in it were the 15 or 20 of us in that group. We're the only ones in the home museum, and it really has a completely different take than when you're in there with, God help you, 900 middle schoolers or whatever.
Then you can just look above their heads.
Yeah, exactly. You all know the only thing worse than 25 8th graders in a classroom? 26 8th graders in the classroom, right? The second program, let's see if we can back up. Okay, here we go. Is the Museum Teacher Fellowship Program. This is a very competitive program. Next year it's in July. I had it quite a while ago. Ashley had it, 3 or 4 years ago. Ashley Libman had it 3 or 4 years ago. Tiffany Hanley had it 2007, I guess it was. And this is a more competitive one for people who are really involved in teaching it. It's a competitive application process. All expenses paid. I mean, they even pay your parking fees at the airport. And it's really a good program. If any of you get really involved with it, get in touch with me and we'll talk about it, because it is a very competitive program. Usually about 15 people per year. I don't want to scare anybody away, but they've had as many as 1,000 applicants for 15 places, which means if you get in, you've accomplished something. But it really is, it gets you to the next level of Holocaust education, I guess I would say. Top line speakers, really make some great great connections with people. We were talking about Kelly before, Kelly Watson, who's at Fishers Junior High, is in that as well. So again, if any of you are interested down the road, you're really doing a lot with this, please let me know and we can talk about the process. The application for that is in March. When is the application for Belford? You remember when it was due?
I think I had to turn in by February.
That makes sense. 3 or 4 months ahead of time. Okay, so that's just about teacher training programs. And then there's some other professional things. There are some lessons online. Let's see here. Yeah, here's the one I was looking for before. Why didn't they just leave? This is an online lesson plan about this question of emigration. Why didn't they just leave? And you can print this very easily, and then you can hand it out to kids or revise it as you see fit. You have different groups do different things. There's a map of the Evian Conference, and then you have a question-answer chart. And then this is a list of we referred to this earlier, this is a list of the requirements that Jews had to meet in order to leave Germany from 1937 on. And then the second list is visa requirements to enter the United States from, I think it was 38 on. And so what students do is they go through and examine these two lists, these two sets of requirements, in terms of all the paperwork that has to be done, or had to be done, in terms of visas, in terms of health certificates, in terms of the U.S. getting a sponsor, because you had to have someone who would be responsible for you financially, in terms of the good conduct document from the local police, which is very difficult for a German Jew to get after 1938. All these different kinds of things. And the thing that's really interesting to note here is all this had to be done within a very relatively short time frame of about 5 to 6 months. And this is before the days of copy machines, before the days of faxes and emails and all that kind of stuff. So everything has to be sent back and forth by hand and by mail and all this kind of stuff. And so it really is a good way of kind of deflecting this question. Because the question, well, why didn't they just leave? Because kids will say, well, gee, if things are going bad, why didn't they just move? Well, that's easier said than done. How do you move when your family has lived in this town for 500 years? How do you leave when grandma won't leave? What do you do with your pets? I mean, all these different kinds of things. And then there's a link here to the story of Klaus Langer. Klaus Langer was one of the boys whose diary was excerpted. There's a very wonderful diary called Salvage Pages. Are any of you familiar with Salvage Pages? Yeah. Salvage Pages was is a collection of excerpts from, I think it's 14 diaries from all over the time period, all over the thing, that were collected by a very wonderful lady by the name of Alexandra Zapruder. The first version of the book was printed, I want to say, about 1988, 1999, and she took these diaries that had never before been translated into English, put them in excerpted forms into this book called Salvage Pages, and then published it. And again, there are all these different diaries from kids living in different places. Some of these kids survived, some of these kids didn't survive. And one of the stories is the story of Klaus Langer, and it talks about his process of emigration. By the way, did any of you catch the name of the editor?
I did.
Alexander Zapruder. Kind of a famous name in American history.
For history teachers.
For history
Anyone
teachers?
has? Who's there?
Film clip.
Film clip. The Zapruder film clip of the Kennedy assassination. When Alex was putting the book together, was the year I had my museum teacher fellowship, and nobody knew Alex at the time. And Steve Feinberg, who was our program director, said, I want to introduce to you a young lady who's working on a very interesting book. This is Alexander Zapruder. And we all went. And the first thing she said was, it was my grandfather. So she spent the first half hour of her time talking about a legal fight, a court case that was going on at that time between her family and the U.S. government over the ownership of the film. And she's actually written extensively about the family's circumstance dealing with the aftermath of the very famous Zapruder film. Anyway, there's some lesson plans there that you can do. Here's one, the U.S. and the Holocaust, History Unfolded, U.S. Newspapers and the Holocaust. Now think about doing some individual research here. You have your kids go to local newspapers, the archives of local newspapers, and find out what was published in Fort Wayne or in Wabash or in Ligonier, whatever it happened to be, or local papers, whatever it happens to be during that particular period of time. I think it's a very interesting process that you could go through. Collaboration and complicity. One of the big museum focuses a couple years ago was a program called They Were Neighbors, about the complicity of people who weren't really perpetrators, but their complicity in knowing what was going on. There was a big museum display, and it's been published in a book and so forth. Oath and Opposition, Education under the Third Reich. One of the historians out there at the museum, Will Meineke, has done a lot of research about education in the Third Reich. It's a really, really interesting thing because you're a teacher. You're a teacher, it's 1935. And you have to sign the Nazi Teachers Oath, or join the Nazi Teachers League in order to keep your job. You're not a Nazi, but you want to keep your job. The pressures that were brought to bear on that kind of thing. And also how virtually, and we talked about this earlier today, how every subject area was politicized. How do you politicize phys ed?
Talk about inherent, physicality of different races?
Actually, you do that in biology.
Okay.
You do that in biology.
I mean, just emphasize the strength. I mean,
Yep.
you're trying to build a strong army here, so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Presidential physical fitness.
Yeah, exactly. You play something called Kampfball, war ball, loose translation. It's kind of like dodgeball, but with a military thing. The idea of military gymnastics. You know, if you think about gymnastics, when we have kids line up and count off by the numbers and do push-ups 1, 2, 3, 4, isn't that militaristic? Sure. Look at the terms we use in football. A long pass is a bomb. When you sack the quarterback, it's the blitz. I mean, so militarizing, or politicizing in this case, phys ed is very, very simple. We talked earlier about how you politicize math. History and literature, that's easy to do. I mean, virtually every subject area was politicized. And so you can talk about that education in the Third Reich. One thing I would suggest you not do, and I sort of led into it and then moved away from it with you folks for just a minute, I'll go back to it. Don't ever say to kids, what would you have done? And I won't say to you as teachers, what would you have done if you were presented with that thing to join the Nazi Teachers League? Why shouldn't you say to somebody, what would you have done?
It's an impossible.
Brooklyn's?
They'd probably have been like, oh, I would totally say those people or something.
And why don't you know?
Well, it's an impossible question to answer, not in those circumstances.
You're not there. It's very easy to say what you have done sitting here as we are in the comfort, warmth, the convenience of where we are. You don't know what you would have done in that kind of circumstance. And that, by the way, is the problem with simulations. One of the problems with simulations. It's very easy to say, oh, I would have done this and that. You don't know until you're in the circumstance. If you want to explain that one to students, you might want to use the following example. When I would talk about this to high school kids, and they would get very upset. Well, of course I would have done the right thing. So I had a standard response. And you remember you're dealing with high school kids. How many of you are lifeguards during the summer? Well, there's always in a class, 2, 3 kids, right? You're a lifeguard, aren't you? Jeff, you're a lifeguard, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how to do CPR, Jeff?
Yep.
Sure, you're not going to be a lifeguard without knowing how to do CPR. Jeff, you see somebody having a heart attack at Glenbrook this afternoon. You know CPR. Can you save their life? And of course, Jeff says what?
Sure.
Sure. And my response is, until you're actually in the situation, the fact that you know how to do CPR and whether or not you can actually do it in a life or death situation are two very, very different things. And I think that's and kids understood that. So don't say, what would you have done? What you can say is, what options were available to that individual and what were the consequences of that options? We mentioned earlier the different groups within the Holocaust. There's one we all want to identify with, and that's the rescuers, right? None of us know what we would have done if our family was in life at stake, but our life was at stake. So instead of saying, would you have been a rescuer, you say, this person in this circumstance, if that person chooses to be a rescuer, what were the potential consequences to that person? That's a valid question. But I don't want to say, Josh, what you have done, because unless he's there, he doesn't know. But I say, Josh, given this circumstance, what might have happened to this person becomes the valid way to frame the question. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, there's some pitfalls here you really have to be aware of. Okay, now what I'm going to do now, we're almost done, so I'm going to go back here. Let me go back to where we are. And go back to the original thing here. Go back to encyclopedia. The entire encyclopedia. I'm going to go to oral history. And we're going to just look at a few clips. And one of the nice things about the clips here on the website is that they're short and focused. The average length is maybe a minute and 45 seconds, and they're very focused. One of the problems with using oral histories is you might have a 45-minute oral history and only 3 minutes applies to your particular topic. So I think this is a good way to be very, very focused in what you do. So I'm just going to pull some out here, and these are not at random. I went back, there's certain ones I wanted to show you just, I think, for their structure and impact. You can do by name, you can do by topic. So let's look at this one. Number 3, Vladka Fagela Peltami. And I chose this one, and the one above him, her husband Bedni, for a reason. And the reason I teach Holocaust is this lady right here. I was doing bits and pieces of it, but when I had the opportunity to go on a program that she ran overseas, Poland and Israel, it was professionally changing and life-changing. She's the most remarkable person I've ever met. She's now deceased. Vladka was a young girl, a young Jewish girl in Warsaw. She had very, quote, Aryan features, blonde hair, blue eyes. She was about 5'1", weighed about 100 pounds, and we were all scared to death of her. I mean, she's remarkable. Her job, because she had these Aryan features, she was able to sneak out of the Warsaw Ghetto and pass for Polish, pass for Aryan. And therefore, what she was able to do was smuggle weapons, particularly dynamite, into the Warsaw Ghetto. And she also smuggled kids out. She would go outside the ghetto. She would find Catholic families willing to hide Jewish kids, and she would then smuggle the kids out of the ghetto. Her book is called, her autobiography is called On Both Sides of the Wall. Again, she's now deceased. She passed away a few years ago. So let me just show you a little clip of Vladka.
While being there at night, I saw the flames of the ghetto. And I saw also certain pictures which were seared in my mind. Some Jews running from one place to the other, and also seeing some Jews jumping from buildings. But I was observing this from a window and I couldn't do anything. And then flames burst into the ghetto. The Germans couldn't take over the streets. They start putting block after block on fire. They start burning the ghettos, the buildings. And this was the uprising which we, the small group on the Iron Side, we tried to get through, we tried to communicate, we decided even to go into the ghetto to be with them, but everything was in vain. We didn't have any communication, we saw only tanks coming in, tanks going out, or some ambulances going in, and we're listening to the shooting, and at that time it was we have to let the outside know what is going on.
Now, to talk about the structure of just this part of the website, again, you can go by name or you can go by event. You could also find this one under Warsaw Ghetto, although there would be many more than just the ones about Władka and Ben. So what you have here is, she was born 1921 in Warsaw. A one-sentence or two-sentence, very brief overview of what the testimony is about. Over here you have the written transcript of what she said, and also on the screen you saw the transcript, and then beneath it you have a general description of the overall circumstance. In this case, it talks about the fact that she was a member of the Socialist Youth Organization, the Jewish Bund, the youth movement, means the future movement or whatever. And then the video, and this video was 1 minute and 32 seconds. Now, I would tell you that using this effectively takes a lot of work because you have to really decide what topics you want to cover, then go in and find them and research them. So this is not something you do 5 minutes before class occurs. You really have to put some effort into it. But if you do, you can really come up with some very, very meaningful things. Let me back out again here. And let's do one or two more of these just to get the idea of it. And the next one I'm going to do, I mentioned Nessie Galper and Godin before. A survivor whom we had here in Fort Wayne a few years ago.